A single adult elephant carries close to 9,000 pounds of meat. That's enough protein to feed an entire village for weeks, off one animal, one kill. And yet almost nowhere on Earth does anyone hunt elephants for food. We eat cows, pigs, chickens, goats, even horses in some countries. Humans are, frankly, willing to eat almost anything that walks, swims, or crawls. But the single largest land animal alive, carrying more meat than 5 cows combined, barely shows up on a plate anywhere. Here's what makes this genuinely strange though, and it's not what you'd expect. Humans didn't always avoid this. Cave paintings in France depict mammoth hunts. Butchered mammoth bones with unmistakable stone tool cut marks have been dug up across Siberia and North America, some over 12,000 years old. Entire Ice Age communities built their actual homes out of mammoth bone because the animal was that central to survival. So somewhere between then and now, something flipped. And once you start pulling the thread, most of the reasons people assume explain this turn out to be wrong. The obvious guess is size, that elephants are simply too big to be practical. That collapses instantly. Whales are considerably bigger, and humans hunted them commercially for centuries, building entire industries around processing animals the size of city buses. Cows aren't small either, and we slaughter something like 300 million of them every single year without a second thought. Size alone was never the actual wall. The next guess is taste. Maybe elephant meat is simply bad, except people who've actually eaten it disagree. Accounts from hunters, colonial-era explorers, and communities that still eat elephant meat today describe it as tough but entirely workable, similar to a very lean, very dense beef, best slow-cooked or dried into strips. Not exactly a delicacy, not remotely inedible either. So if it's not size and it's not taste, what actually killed the business model? There's also the small matter of trying to actually catch one. A threatened elephant is not a slow, gentle giant. A charging elephant can hit speeds close to 25 miles an hour while weighing as much as a loaded pickup truck, capable of flipping a vehicle or ending a person in seconds. And elephants still kill several hundred people worldwide every single year. For most of human history, hunting one meant risking your best hunters for a payoff that was never guaranteed. Compared to that, a deer or a wild pig starts looking a lot more reasonable, easier to catch, safer to kill, and considerably less likely to fight back like a small tank. Here's where the real explanation starts, and it's colder and more practical than anything cultural. A female elephant carries a pregnancy for nearly 22 months, the longest gestation period of any land mammal on Earth. After that birth, she'll typically wait another 4 to 5 years before having another calf. Compare that to a cow, which can produce a new calf every single year, or a chicken, which lays hundreds of eggs annually. If you tried farming elephants for meat the way we farm cattle, you'd wait the better part of a decade just to replace the single animal you killed. Researchers studying African elephant population dynamics have found that even under ideal conditions, populations grow by only a few percent annually. Push hunting pressure past that ceiling even slightly, and the population doesn't recover. It collapses outright. And that's precisely what happened, just for a reason almost nobody expects. In the late 1800s and into the 1900s, elephants across Africa and Asia were slaughtered by the millions, not primarily for meat at all, but for ivory, piano keys, billiard balls, jewelry, decorative carvings sold across Europe and America. Historians estimate that between 1979 and 1989 alone, Africa's elephant population was cut roughly in half, dropping from over 1 million animals to around 600,000, driven almost entirely by the ivory trade. Meat was never the point. Tusks were worth more than the rest of the animal combined, and carcasses were frequently left to rot in the field the moment the ivory got removed. By the time global conservation finally caught up, in 1989, the international ivory trade was banned outright under CITES, the treaty regulating trade in endangered species. Killing an elephant for any commercial purpose, meat included, became illegal across nearly the entire planet, and both African and Asian elephants remain classified as endangered today. You simply cannot build a food industry around an animal it's illegal to kill. But legality alone doesn't fully explain the discomfort, because there's something else sitting underneath all of it, and it has nothing to do with law or economics. Researchers Cynthia Moss and Joyce Poole, who've spent decades observing wild elephants in Kenya, have documented behavior that looks unmistakably like grief. Elephants return to the bones of dead herd members, sometimes years later, touching skulls and tusks gently with their trunks, standing near a body in what genuinely resembles a silent vigil. In 2006, researchers confirmed elephants passed the mirror self-recognition test, a benchmark cleared previously only by great apes, dolphins, hens and magpies, meaning an elephant recognizes itself as an individual rather than reacting to its reflection as though it were a stranger. Combine that with tight matriarchal family bonds, complex vocal communication, and memory sharp enough to recall dangerous migration routes decades later, and you start understanding why so many people find the idea of eating one deeply uncomfortable, even without being able to fully explain why. Here's the honest complication, because the taboo isn't quite as universal as it sounds. In parts of Central and West Africa, elephant meat genuinely does show up in bushmeat markets. In countries like Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Gabon, almost always as a secondary byproduct of elephants killed illegally by poachers chasing ivory. The meat gets sold off almost as an afterthought. And there's a stranger twist buried in the legal side of this story. In countries like Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, elephant populations in specific regions have actually grown large enough to strain farmland and clash with local communities. To manage that, these governments issue a limited number of legal hunting permits annually, often to trophy hunters. When one of these hunts happens, the meat doesn't go to waste. Wildlife authorities have documented culled elephants being butchered on site, with meat distributed directly to nearby villages, sometimes delivering more protein in a single day than a community would otherwise see in months. The only places on Earth where eating elephant meat is fully legal and openly organized are the same countries most aggressively working to keep elephant populations under control. There's also a simpler economic argument sitting underneath all of this. A living elephant is generally worth far more than a dead one. Safari tourism across countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and Botswana generates significantly more revenue per animal per year than a one-time sale of meat ever could, giving governments a genuine financial incentive to keep elephants alive, visible, and photographed rather than butchered. Layer culture on top of all this, and the picture gets even more resistant to a single tidy explanation. Across South and Southeast Asia, elephants were domesticated for labor long before conservation ever entered the conversation, hauling logs, carrying soldiers into battle, working fields alongside farmers for generations in India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Myanmar. An animal you genuinely depend on for daily work isn't an animal you casually eat. The same underlying logic behind why horse meat carries a real cultural taboo anywhere horses were essential labor rather than livestock. In Hindu tradition, the elephant-headed deity Ganesha remains one of the most widely worshipped gods in India, representing wisdom and new beginnings. Killing and eating an elephant in that context isn't just impractical, it edges close to unthinkable. So the real answer was never one clean explanation. It's a stack of separate reasons, each one reinforcing the next. Elephants breed far too slowly to ever function as livestock. International law made killing them for any commercial reason a crime. Entire cultures built spiritual and working relationships with them that made eating one feel like betrayal. And modern science keeps confirming that the animal on the other end of that decision is genuinely closer to us than most people would like to admit, capable of memory, grief, and recognizing its own reflection. Humans didn't stop eating elephants because we ran out of appetite for large animals. We stopped because we drove them to the edge of extinction, chasing something else entirely, and then spent the better part of a century trying to pull them back from it. The meat was never really the story here. The ivory was. And in more places than most people realize, the elephants are still quietly paying for it. See you in the next one.